Some men raise a glass of crystal-clear champagne to celebrate a promising future. I raised mine to remember every single word being whispered about my daughter, in a language they thought I would never understand. Smile, Gideon. Just keep smiling and pour the vintage. That was the quiet, rhythmic mantra I kept repeating to myself at that corner table at Acre and Vine, the most exclusive restaurant nestled in the hills of Oakville, California. I had booked the table 3 full weeks in advance, pulling in favors from old friends in the valley, just to make sure everything was absolutely flawless. The restaurant sits high up on a ridgeline, with floor-to-ceiling glass windows that look out over rolling terraced vineyards, split-rail redwood fences, and ancient oak trees standing guard in the twilight. It is the kind of view that says we belong here, we have arrived, without anyone ever having to raise their voice to say it out loud. Napa Valley in late summer has a specific kind of gold. It's a deep, heavy, dust-blown amber that clings to the dry hillsides and settles in the hollows of the ancient oak trees. The air smells of dry wild oat straw, crushed bay laurel leaves, and the sweet scent of ripening grapes hanging in heavy clusters beneath the emerald canopy. It's a landscape carved out of stubborn volcanic clay, by generations of people who had nothing but shovel, sweat, and a belief that something beautiful could grow from stone. I wanted Mateo's parents to feel welcomed. I wanted them to feel like Napa Valley wasn't some flyover, uncultured valley between San Francisco and nowhere. More than anything, I wanted my daughter Clara to look around that beautifully set table, with its white linen and wildflower centerpieces, and see her entire world sitting in one room, finally getting along. I didn't get that. I got something else entirely, and it began the very second the wine list was placed in their hands. You see, to truly understand the tension at that table, you have to understand the land we were looking out over. Napa Valley is not just a geographic coordinate on a map. It is a complex living tapestry of microclimates and microsoils. The western slopes where Acre and Vine rests are composed of gravelly loam and ancient alluvial fans that have washed down from the Mayacamas Mountains over millions of years. This soil, this dry, rocky, unforgiving dirt, forces the roots of the vines to dig 50 feet deep into the earth, clawing through layers of basalt and shale just to find a single drop of water. That struggle is what gives the fruit its intensity, its thick skin, and its dark, concentrated tannin. It is a slow, painful process, but it is the only way to produce a Cabernet Sauvignon that carries the true, unyielding signature of the valley. Lorenzo and Bianca Rossi, coming from the soft, clay-rich hills of Tuscany, saw none of this. To them, Napa was a modern, synthetic creation of marketing and money, a playground for wealthy tech executives and retired bankers who bought vineyards as if they were expensive sports cars to show off to their friends. They did not understand that the soil beneath our feet had been paid for in sweat, broken bones, and 3 decades of silent, back-breaking labor. They saw only the glass and the granite of the restaurant, and they assumed everything else was just as superficial, just as easy to dismantle with a few polished words and a cold, aristocratic sneer. I watched Lorenzo run his finger down the gold-embossed leather cover of the wine list, his eye skipping over some of the finest single Vineyard bottlings in the world, with a slow theatrical shake of his head. He looked like a priest who had been asked to evaluate a heretical text, his thin lips pressed together in a tight, pale line that carried the weight of 5 centuries of Florentine snobbery. Beside him, Bianca was adjusting her heavy emerald earrings, the deep green stones catching the soft amber light of the table candles and casting tiny glinting shadows across her hollow cheeks. She wore her elegance like armor, a cold, rigid shield designed to keep the new world at a safe, polite distance. And Matteo sits there in his tailored Italian suit, looking between his parents and my daughter with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to navigate the narrow, hazardous gaps between wealth and ruin. He was beautiful, my daughter's fiancé. He had the kind of dark, symmetric Florentine features, deep brown eyes, and effortless charm that makes you want to believe every word that comes out of his mouth. Clara looked at him as if he were a miracle, a door to a wider, more romantic world that she had only read about in books. But as I sat there in my department store dress shirt, feeling the rough sandpaper texture of my calloused hands resting on my knees beneath the white linen tablecloth. I felt a familiar, cold sensation settling deep into my chest. It was the exact same feeling I used to get when I was a young mason, standing at the base of an old crumbling stone wall, looking at the tiny, almost invisible fractures in the foundation that told me the entire structure was waiting for the first hard frost to collapse. "Is this the Napa Cabernet you selected, Gideon?" Lorenzo asked, holding the bottle of my own private reserve vintage by the neck as if it had personally insulted him. His heavy, aristocratic Italian accent made every word sound like a clinical verdict handed down from a high court. "In Florence, we would not even use this to braise the wild boar. It is far too jammy, far too unrefined. It lacks the intellectual structure of a true Chianti Classico. It's actually produced from the block of vines directly behind my home," I said, keeping my voice mild and even, offering the easy, accommodating smile of a host who had spent 30 years learning how to swallow his own pride for the sake of others. "Local soil, local sun. It's won a few gold medals, but I'm always eager to hear feedback." "Ah, how wonderfully resourceful of you," Bianca murmured, offering me the exact kind of thin, patronizing smile you give to a small child who has just showed you a crude crayon drawing on a napkin. "And what is it you do again, Gideon?" "Landscaping, was it?" She said the word landscaping with a delicate, sharp-edged sigh, as if she would need to thoroughly wash her hands with lemon water just for having spoken it aloud. "Contracting and vineyard restoration," I replied gently, setting my butter knife down. "I build stone terraces, rebuild historic wine caves, and restore the soil chemistry of old, neglected estates so they can produce premium fruit again. Mostly custom stonework and land management now." "How incredibly practical," Bianca said, immediately turning her back on me to look out the window, dismissing my life's work as if I'd just told her I collected aluminum cans for a living. Practical. Like I was a useful servant they had hired to clear the brush from their path. I let it slide. I looked across the table, and I saw Clara laughing at something Matteo had just whispered in her ear, her small hand resting comfortably in his. And that right there was worth every backhanded, razor-sharp compliment these two old-world snobs could throw at me over a plate of imported truffles. I have been broke in my life. I have slept in the back of my rusted Ford F-150 between stone-laying jobs when I was 24, too stubborn and too proud to call my own father for help. I know exactly how to eat condescension with a smile. You do it for the people you love. You swallow the bile, you nod, and you let them think they are the center of the universe, because your daughter's happiness is the only currency that actually matters in the end. What I didn't expect, however, was for them to believe that their native language was a locked door. Welcome to Dad's hidden revenge. Get comfortable. This story is going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Here is the one crucial detail that nobody sitting at that beautifully lit table knew about me. Not Matteo, not his elegant high society parents, and certainly not Clara. In my mid-20s, long before I ever bought my first acre of Napa scrubland, I spent 5 grueling, beautiful years working as an apprentice stone mason in Italy. I lived in the hills outside of Siena, and later in the rugged, sun-baked terraced vineyards of Piedmont. I didn't learn Italian from some high-priced university professor in a sterile classroom. I learned it on my knees in the dirt, getting yelled at by ancient sun-weathered quarry foremen, until I understood every single dialect, every vulgar slang, and every subtle shift in inflection. My mentor back then was an old Tuscan mason named Giovanni. He was 72 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of dry travertine stone and hands so thick and calloused they looked like oak roots. Giovanni didn't speak a word of English, and he had absolutely no patience for a young, clumsy American apprentice who didn't know how to swing a hammer or find the grain in a block of limestone. For the first 6 months, he didn't even call me by my name. He simply called me Il Mulo, the mule, and yelled at me in a rapid, gravelly mix of Florentine slang and ancient quarryman jargon every time I made a bad cut or let a joint run crooked. He would grab my wrists with a grip like an iron vise, force my hands down onto the cold, damp stone, and make me run my fingers along the surface until I could feel the microscopic fractures that the eye couldn't see. "Stone doesn't lie, Mulo," he would whisper in his native Italian, his breath smelling of strong Toscano cigars and cheap red table wine. "People lie. They lie with their eyes, their smiles, and their promises. But stone is always honest. If you build a wall with a lie in the foundation, the earth will find it, the rain will soften it, and the winter frost will tear it down. Remember that. Never trust a stone that doesn't want to fit." I spent 5 years in those hills, working 10-hour days in the damp limestone quarries of Siena and the steep terraced vineyards of Piedmont. I lived in a tiny, drafty stone cottage that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, eating nothing but stale bread, garlic, and wild chicory I gathered from the roadsides. I learned how to dry stack retaining walls that could hold back 10,000 tons of volcanic mountain clay without a single cup of concrete. I learned how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds over the Apennines, how to prune old-growth Sangiovese vines so they would produce fruit even in a drought, and how to speak Italian with the elegant, sharp-edged cadence of a Florentine aristocrat. When I finally came home to California, I carried those 5 years of silent, grueling education in my bones, but I kept quiet about it. In Napa Valley, when you're bidding on a contracting job to build a stone terrace or clear a block drainage ditch for a wealthy winery owner, nobody cares if you can swing a sledgehammer and move dirt. So I let the language go quiet. I let them think I was just another silent, hard-working American contractor with dirt under his fingernails and wood smoke on his clothes. It was a useful shield. It allowed me to move through the valley unnoticed, to build my business brick by brick, and to protect my daughter from the sharks and the speculators who had started circling our beautiful valley in search of easy prey. I spent years splitting heavy blocks of Pietra Serena limestone, hauling gray marble in Carrara, and watching how old-world masons laid dry stack foundations that stood for 600 years without a drop of mortar. I learned that stone doesn't lie. If you try to force a joint or hide a bad cut, the winter frost will find it, expand, and tear your work apart before the year is out. You have to listen to its natural grain. And I had learned their language too, the fast, elegant, Florentine accented Italian that Lorenzo and Bianca used as if it were a private velvet curtain separating them from the common world. I came home to California completely fluent in the language of stone and the language of Italy, but I kept quiet about it. In Napa Valley, when you're bidding on a contracting job to build a retaining wall, clear a drainage ditch, or carve a wine cave out of volcanic rhyolite, nobody cares if you can read Dante's Inferno in the original Italian. It never came up. It never mattered. Until that Thursday night, about halfway through the main course, Lorenzo leaned toward Bianca, his eyes scanning the dining room with a thin, mocking glint, and said something in low, rapid Italian, with a small, dry chuckle at the end of it. He thought he was perfectly safe. He thought the heavy, calloused-handed American contractor, sitting across from him, was just another provincial simpleton who only understood the language of shovels and concrete. "They are completely rustic," Lorenzo murmured in Italian, his voice low but cutting through the ambient hum of the restaurant like a knife through soft wax. "Look at his hands. He has dirt under his fingernails even at his daughter's engagement dinner. And that shirt. It looks like it was purchased from a department store catalog. He has no dignity. He acts as if we are equals because he owns a few vines." Bianca took a slow, delicate sip of her sparkling water, her eyes resting on me with a cold, glassy amusement. "It is pathetic," she replied in her native Italian, her pronunciation perfect and dripping with a quiet, generational venom. "But what did you expect, Lorenzo? These Americans have no lineage. They think because they own a few acres of dirt in California, they are winemakers. They are merely farmers who got lucky with the weather. The girl is pretty, I suppose, but she has the manners of a schoolteacher. She lacks the bloodline of a true estate heiress." I kept my face absolutely still. I didn't blink. I didn't tighten my jaw. I kept my knife moving across my steak with the steady, practiced precision of a man who had spent 30 years carving limestone block to the millimeter. I let my ears absorb every single syllable, recording the exact frequency of their contempt, while my face remained a perfect, unreadable mask of hospitable American warmth Then, Bianca's cold eyes wandered past my shoulder toward the wall near the hostess stand, where the restaurant's owner had displayed a small gallery of local master craftsmanship, a rotating exhibit of custom woodwork and masonry from artisans around the valley. Framed under a soft spotlight was a large, high-resolution photograph of a beautiful hand-carved redwood wine trestle and tasting table. It was my table. I had built it with my own 2 hands using 500-year-old reclaimed redwood flume timber I'd salvaged from an abandoned mountain winery in the hills above St. Helena. I spent 4 months sanding, curing, and carving the intricate grape leaf patterns along its base for Clara's 12th birthday. She had kept her school books on it, her drawing pads, and later, the first test bottles of her own boutique wine vintages. It was a piece of my soul, carved into wood. It represented the exact summer when I almost lost everything to a bad harvest, but we survived because we had each other. Bianca tilted her head at the photograph, her mouth curling into a small, amused sneer. "Look at that monstrosity on the wall," she whispered in Italian, gesturing slightly with her salad fork. "He probably found that wood rotting in a swamp. These Americans have absolutely no concept of true design. They simply bolt a crude chunk of timber together, coat it in cheap lacquer, and call it craftsmanship. It is laughable. The wood looks like it came from an old barn." I set my fork down. Not hard. Not enough to make a scene or draw a look from Clara. I just set it down with a slow, deliberate click against the porcelain plate. It was the kind of quiet, heavy pause that, if you knew me, you'd know meant the wind had just shifted and a storm was rolling in off the Pacific. She was talking about the table I had built for my little girl. She was talking about 4 months of my sweat, my late nights in the workshop, my devotion, as if it were garbage I had dragged out of a local dumpster. Matteo was busy refilling his sparkling water, completely oblivious. Clara was looking down at her phone, her face lit by the soft blue screen as she smiled at a congratulatory text from her cousin. I looked up and my eyes locked onto Lorenzo's. He gave me a brief testing glance, the quick, defensive reflex of a predator checking to see if the prey had noticed the rustle in the grass. I smiled at him. An easy, warm, completely open American smile. The kind of smile that says everything is absolutely fine, we're all friends here, and the sun is shining. "You know, Lorenzo," I said in English, my voice quiet, smooth, and conversational as I folded my hands on the edge of the table. "I've always believed that the things a man builds with his own 2 hands tell you far more about his true character than anything he could ever buy with someone else's money. Don't you agree?" Lorenzo blinked, his elegant posture freezing for a fraction of a second. Of course, Gideon." "Naturally, good," I said, leaning back as the waiter arrived to clear our plates. "Because I'd hate for anyone sitting at this table to think I don't know the exact difference between something cheap that is destined to fall apart and something genuine that is built to stand the test of time." I let those words hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds, just long enough for the silence to stretch, but not quite long enough to make it awkward. Lorenzo and Bianca looked at each other, a tiny, almost invisible flicker of unease passing between them before they brushed it off, confident in their absolute superiority. They had no earthly idea what I had just understood. But that was only the preamble. The real betrayal came 20 minutes later, just as the dessert plates were being cleared and the espresso was served. Bianca leaned toward Matteo, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, but she didn't look at him. Her cold, calculating eyes remained locked on me. "Are the papers fully prepared, Matteo?" she asked in Italian. Matteo nodded, barely looking up from his cup of dark espresso. "Yes, Mama," he replied in fluent Italian, his voice low and utterly devoid of the warm, doting tone he always used when speaking to Clara in English. "The lawyers in San Francisco finalized the draft yesterday. We will present it to him next week, right before the wedding rehearsals begin." "And the land?" Lorenzo asked, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous beat against his crystal water glass. "It is exactly as we planned," Matteo whispered back in Italian, a tiny, smug smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "The dumb contractor has no idea how valuable his highway-adjacent acreage actually is. He thinks we are doing him a grand favor by merging our family estates. He is so incredibly desperate for old-world wine pedigree and European social standing. that he will sign literally anything I put in front of him. He is completely predictable. He wants his little girl to be happy so badly that his eyes are entirely closed. We will secure the Naipa property, use it to secure the line of credit in Switzerland, and by the time they realize the Tuscany estate has been liquidated, the American land will be fully under our name. I kept my face perfectly still. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my water. I sat there, a silent, invisible monument of stone, while my daughter's future husband, the man who had stood on my front porch 4 months ago, with actual glistening tears in his eyes as he begged for my blessing, called her father a predictable fool, and called her nothing more than a profitable line item in a foreign bankruptcy scheme. My coffee was growing cold in front of me. I looked at Clara, my beautiful, brilliant girl, who was sitting there with a bright, radiant smile on her face, completely unaware that the man she was about to build her entire life with was currently rehearsing her financial execution in a language she didn't speak. Every protective, primal instinct inside my chest wanted to roar. Every part of me wanted to stand up, flip that white-clothed table into their expensive laps, and drag my daughter out of that restaurant by her hand. But I didn't, because I have spent 30 years working with stone, and if stone teaches you anything, it is that impatience ruins the block. If you strike too early, if you let your anger swing the hammer, you shatter the marble and leave nothing but useless gravel behind. If you want to build something that lasts, you wait, you watch, you let the natural fractures reveal themselves. So I kept mouth shut. I paid the check in cash, leaving a generous 30% tip for the staff, and I walked them out to the valet. I shook Lorenzo's hand, I kissed Bianca's cold cheek, and I told them both that the evening had been an absolute revelation. And as I watched their rental Mercedes sedan pull away into the dark Napa night, I made myself a silent, unshakable promise. They think I am a fool. They think the game is already won, but they have no idea who they just invited to the table. I am going to find out exactly what papers they are planning to slide across my study desk next week. And when I do, I am going to let them explain it to me themselves, in whatever language they are most comfortable using. I put the truck in reverse, backed out slowly, and drove home along Silverado Trail, the cool night air blowing through the cracked window. My head was too full to trust myself with a yellow light, so I stayed in the slow lane, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to leave white prints in the leather. Clara texted me before I had even turned onto my gravel driveway. "Dad, thank you so much for tonight," her message read. "It meant everything to me that you tried so hard with them. I know they can be difficult, but they really do want us to be family." I parked the Tacoma under the dark canopy of the valley oak trees, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. She had absolutely no idea what I had heard at that table. The truth was going to break her heart, but I knew with the absolute certainty of a builder who had spent his life evaluating stress loads, that a clean, sharp break now was infinitely better than watching her get slowly crushed under the weight of their lies for the rest of her life. I texted back, "Anything for you, sweetheart. Get some rest." The next morning, I didn't make coffee. I didn't walk out to the vines to check the sugar levels of the grapes. I sat in my old Tacoma in the driveway for a long, quiet hour, watching the fog roll off the Mayacamas mountains and settle over my 60 acres of prime, debt-free estate land. This 60-acre parcel was the crowning achievement of my life. I had bought it 30 years ago when it was nothing but volcanic rock, poison oak, and wild brush. I had spent 15 years clearing the stones, terrace by terrace, dry stacking the walls with my own hands until the land was transformed into one of the most sought-after hillside vineyards in the entire county. And now, a family of bankrupt Italian aristocrats wanted to steal it to pay off their European creditors. I called Marcus Sterling. Marcus had been my closest friend and my business attorney for 25 years. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't keep mahogany furniture or expensive oil paintings in his office, because he preferred to spend his money on investigators who were very, very good at finding things people had spent a lifetime trying to hide. "Marcus, it's Gideon," I said when he picked up. "I need a favor, and I need you to be exceptionally thorough." "What's going on, Gid?" Marcus's voice was instantly alert. "You sound like you just found a crack in a foundation." "I did," I said. I need you to dig into the Rossi family estate in Florence, Lorenzo and Bianca Rossi, and their son, Matteo. I want to know about their wineries, their debts, their assets, and every single active lawsuit they've got pending in the European Union. Give me 48 hours, Marcus said. I didn't wait 48 hours to start playing my part. If you want to catch a predator, you have to make them believe the trap is just a wider pasture. If they think you are a clueless, desperate fool, you let them believe it with every fiber of your being. At noon on Friday, I called Clara. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light, warm, and entirely normal as I stood in my kitchen. I was thinking, why don't Lorenzo and Bianca stay in the estate guest cottage for the rest of the week? It's much nicer than their boutique hotel in Yountville, and it'll save them the drive back and forth. It'll give us a real chance to share some dinners, pour some wine, and really get to know each other before the rehearsal dinner next Saturday. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Clara's breath catch. "Dad, are you sure? I know Thursday night was incredibly stiff. Lorenzo was aggressive about the Cabernet, and Bianca isn't exactly warm, sweetheart. I want this family to work." I lied, and every single word of it was true, just not in the way she imagined. "I'm happy to host them. Let me do this for you." "Oh, Dad, thank you so much," she gasped, and I could hear the immense weight of anxiety lifting off her shoulders. "That means the absolute world to me. I'll call Matteo right now." I hung up the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the guest cottage. It was a beautiful, hand-built stone cabin with a redwood deck, tucked under the shade of two massive walnut trees. I had built it stone by stone the summer Clara turned 12, using river rock I'd hauled from the Napa River. "You want a front-row seat to my life, Lorenzo?" I murmured, watching a hawk circle slow over the mountain ridgeline. "Come on in, sit by my fire. Just remember that stone walls have very long ears, and I can hear you in every language you've got." Lorenzo and Bianca moved into the guest cottage that Thursday afternoon. Matteo stayed at Clara's apartment in downtown Napa, which was a massive strategic relief. It meant I only had to manage 2 actors under my own roof rather than 3. And for the next 5 days, I gave the performance of a lifetime. I became the grateful, simple-minded, star-struck American father-in-law they expected me to be. I asked Bianca about her historic gardens in Fiesole, nodding with wide-eyed admiration as she lectured me on classical symmetry. I let Lorenzo stand over my shoulder at the backyard grill, letting him correct my technique as I grilled prime ribeyes over seasoned red oak. He stood there with a glass of my best Cabernet, telling me the meat would be far superior if I had marinated it in a proper olive oil from his region. I smiled, I nodded, and I said, "I'll certainly have to try that next time, Lorenzo," while internally my mind was cataloging every syllable, every phonetic structure, and every glance they exchanged. I was building a file, and I was doing it in their own language. They sat on my redwood deck in the evenings, drinking my wine, and talked openly about their plans in Italian, assuming I was nothing more than a dumb, hard-working peasant who was too busy cleaning their dishes to understand their words. On Monday night, Marcus Sterling called me back. "Gideon," he said, his voice flat, professional, and dead serious. "I hope you're sitting down. This is about as ugly as it gets." "Talk to me," I said, leaning against my workbench in the dark study. "Lorenzo's winery, Tenuta Rossi? It's a complete financial ghost ship," Marcus said, the sound of rustling paper coming through the line. "They filed for the Italian equivalent of court-supervised debt restructuring 2 years ago. They owe over €9 million to the Bank of Florence, and their historic villa in Tuscany has active tax liens stacked against it dating back to 2022. They are weeks away from a public foreclosure auction." "And Matteo?" I asked, my grip tightening on the edge of the wood desk. "Matteo is the primary guarantor on those loans," Marcus said. "He ran an import-export business in Milan that collapsed 3 years ago, leaving a string of angry private investors who have filed active civil fraud lawsuits against him in the Florentine courts. He's not an aristocrat, Gideon. He's a polished, desperate con artist trying to outrun a prison sentence for fraudulent bankruptcy." I sat in the dark, the silence of my study stretching out like a deep valley. "What about the trust papers he's preparing?" I asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. "That is the real kicker, Gid. I had one of my colleagues in San Francisco take a look at the preliminary draft Mateo's lawyers logged. They are calling it a joint family agricultural trust to protect your estate and Clara's future winemaking assets. But the underlying legal structure is an offshore cross-collateralization agreement. I sat in the dark of my study, the silent telephone pressed tight against my ear, listening to the steady, mechanical click of Marcus shuffling the legal papers on his end of the line. The only light in the room came from the green glass shade of my old banker's lamp, casting a long, emerald shadow across the oak desk and the blueprints of my vineyard. I could hear the wind howling through the old oak trees outside, carrying the sharp, cold scent of dry pine needles and coastal fog from the Pacific. "Explain that to me in carpenter terms, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, dangerous register. "They have designed this trust like a double-bottomed boat." "Gid," Marcus said, his tone carrying the cold, clinical authority of a surgeon explaining a terminal diagnosis. "On the surface, it looks like a beautiful, fair partnership. It says that you are committing your 60 acres of hillside Cabernet vines, and the Rossi family is committing their historic estate, Tenuta Rossi, in Tuscany, to a joint holding company registered in Luxembourg. It claims this will protect Clara's future winemaking brand, giving her access to European distribution and the historic pedigree of an ancient family name. But if you flip the page and read the small print in Section 12, under the clause for asset realization and debt integration, you find the poison." Marcus paused, and I heard him take a slow sip of what I knew was cold coffee. "They have structured the holding company so that your Napa land acts as the primary loan guarantor for the Rossi family's European liabilities," he explained. "Matteo Rossi has a private line of credit with a private merchant bank in Geneva, Switzerland, worth approximately €8.5 million. The collateral for that loan was supposed to be their historic villa and winery in Tuscany. But since the Italian courts have already frozen their Tuscan assets due to outstanding tax liens and civil fraud claims, the Swiss bank was preparing to call the loan. If they call that loan, Matteo faces immediate, personal bankruptcy and a criminal investigation for asset hiding under Italian law. He's looking at a prison cell, Gideon. So they need a new piece of meat to throw to the Swiss wolves," I said, the realization washing over me like ice water. "Exactly," Marcus said. "By transferring your debt-free $18 million Napa hillside vineyard into this joint Luxembourg trust, you are legally volunteering your land to guarantee Matteo's Swiss loans. The very second the trust is signed at your rehearsal dinner next Saturday, the Swiss lenders will register a first-priority lien against your property. And 30 days later, when the Rossi family defaults on their European debts, which they are legally guaranteed to do because their Italian business is already in court-supervised liquidation, the Swiss bank will execute the lien. They will seize your vineyard, sell it at a private offshore auction to the highest bidder, and you and Clara won't have a single legal avenue to appeal it in an American court. It is airtight, Gid. It is a legal execution wrapped in a silk wedding ribbon. Explain that to me in plain English, Marcus. If you sign that trust, Gideon, you are legally committing your 60 acres of debt-free Napa land, which is currently appraised at $18 million, as the primary loan guarantor for the Rossi family's European debts. The moment the Italian banks foreclose on their Tuscany property, which they absolutely will do next month, the offshore lenders have an immediate, unappealable legal right to seize your land to settle the debt. They aren't trying to join your family, Gideon. They are trying to strip mine your life's work to pay off their foreign creditors." I sat there in the quiet room, the dark hills of Napa visible through the window, and my heart went completely cold. They didn't fly 6,000 miles to celebrate my daughter's wedding. They flew 6,000 miles because they needed a lamb to slaughter, and they thought I was the perfect, desperate target. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. The days leading up to the rehearsal dinner moved with a strange, double-time rhythm, excruciatingly slow in the quiet hours of the night, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, yet terrifyingly fast during the day as the floral arrangements arrived. The catering trucks lined the driveway, and Clara floated through the house in a state of pure, unadulterated joy. She had found her dress, a simple, elegant white silk gown that caught the afternoon light. She would show me photos of table settings, asking if I preferred the rustic oak chargers or the polished silver ones. "What do you think, Dad? White roses or the wildflower mix?" "Wildflowers, sweetheart," I had texted back, my hand trembling slightly as I typed the words. "Always the wildflowers. Because in a week, my beautiful girl, I am going to hand you back a life that is actually yours. I want it to look like something that grew naturally in this soil, not something imported from a rotten garden across the ocean." Every evening I sat across the dinner table from Lorenzo and Bianca. I still let Bianca correct my pronunciation of bruschetta. I still let Lorenzo explain why American soil was too young to produce a wine with actual soul. I still shook Matteo's hand when he arrived, letting him call me Gid with that easy, brilliant white smile of his. I watched him hold my daughter's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her knuckles, and I wondered how a human being could look so beautiful on the outside, while being so completely rotted on the inside. The rehearsal dinner was set for Saturday evening on the stone terrace behind my house. We had hung hundreds of delicate string lights through the branches of the ancient oak trees I had planted, the same year Clara was born. The long tables were draped in soft white linen, decorated with wildflower centerpieces, mason jars filled with Queen Anne's lace, and bottles of my private reserve Cabernet sitting under the glowing lights. 40 of our closest friends, local vintners, and family members were laughing, drinking, and passing platters of grilled local trout and roasted vegetables down the tables. It was a picture-perfect California summer evening, and I was the only person in that beautiful space who knew the entire thing was a stage play about to be permanently shut down. Lorenzo and Bianca sat near the head of the table, champagne flutes in hand, sipping the expensive vintage I had purchased specifically for this night, though not for the reason they believed. Bianca wore a cream-colored silk dress that probably cost more than my first tractor. Lorenzo had that same easy, patronizing, aristocratic smile he'd worn since the night we met, looking around my terrace as if he already owned the stone beneath his feet. Marcus Sterling was there too, sitting off to the side in a casual linen blazer, quietly sipping a club soda. He looked like any other old family friend, but beneath his chair was a heavy briefcase containing the translated, notarized, and airtight documents from the Italian courts and banks. He caught my eye once across the crowded table and gave me the smallest, gravest nod. "Ready when you are, Gideon." I looked at Clara. She was sitting near the center of the table, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the string lights, laughing with her college friends. She looked so young, so incredibly happy, and so completely vulnerable. My heart ached for the blow I was about to deliver to her, but some wounds have to be cut deep and clean if you want the patient to survive. I would rather break her heart tonight than watch them slowly, methodically dismantle her entire life, her dignity, and her future for the next 20 years. I stood up. I picked up my crystal wine glass and tapped it once with my silver ring. The sharp, clear chime cut clean through the laughter and the clinking of plates. One by one, the conversations dropped off until the only sound left was the crickets in the vineyard and the gentle rustle of the oak leaves in the evening breeze. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," I said, standing at the head of the table. "I promise I won't keep you from your dessert for long." A warm chuckle ran down the long tables. Clara beamed at me, her eyes filled with that soft, immensely grateful look she had worn ever since our dinner at Acre and Vine. "Most of you know me," I began, looking around at the 40 faces. "I'm a man who works with stone and soil. I don't love speeches. I'd much rather be up on a mountain clearing a drainage ditch or building a retaining wall than standing up here with all of you looking at me." Another easy laugh rippled through the crowd. I saw Matteo lean back in his chair, a loose, comfortable smile on his face as he took a casual sip of his champagne. He was completely relaxed. He thought the deal was closed. "But my daughter is getting married in 2 weeks," I continued, my voice steady, warm, and measured. "And ever since the very first day she was born, I have spent every single waking hour of my life trying to give her a world where she never has to wonder if she is safe, where she never has to wonder if she is loved. and most importantly, where she never has to wonder if the people around her are telling her the absolute truth. I let that sentence sit in the air for a second. The warmth in the room began to shift, just a fraction, as people noticed the quiet, intense gravity in my tone. I want to thank Lorenzo and Bianca, I said, turning toward them and raising my glass slightly, for traveling all this way from Florence to be a part of this family. It's not a small thing, crossing an ocean for people you barely know. Lorenzo dipped his head with practiced, aristocratic grace. The pleasure is entirely ours, Gideon, he said in English. I'm sure it is, I replied. Something in the way I said those 4 words made Bianca's smile flicker. Just a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of her mouth. The sudden, instinctive reaction of someone who felt a cold draft under a door they thought was completely sealed. And since our guests traveled all the way from Tuscany, I said, taking a slow step toward the head of the table, I thought it only fitting that I honor them tonight in their own native language. Especially since they have spent the last 10 days assuming that the simple American contractor sitting across from them couldn't understand a single, solitary word of it. I paused. I looked directly into Lorenzo's eyes, and then, without breaking character, I switched seamlessly into elegant, flawless Italian, my voice carrying the sharp, aristocratic Florentine accent I had perfected 30 years ago. Continuiamo in Italiano allora, I said, my voice cutting through the silent terrace like a steel blade. I watched Lorenzo's champagne glass freeze halfway to his mouth. Bianca went entirely rigid in her chair, her face turning a strange ash-gray color under the warm string lights. Per 10 giorni, I continued in Italian, my voice calm, cold, and utterly relentless. Avete cenato alla mia tavola, bevuto il mio vino e dormito sotto il mio tetto. E per tutto quel tempo avete parlato di mia già come se lei fosse un pezzo di carne da macellare. Avete deriso il mio lavoro, insultato la mia casa, e chiamato Clara un'americana sciocca che può essere facilmente manipolata. Matteo scrambled in his chair, his face flushing a deep, violent red as he tried to stand. Gideon, stop. Zitto, Matteo, I said, my voice dropping into a low, commanding growl that made him freeze instantly. Non hai il diritto di parlare alla mia tavola. Hai finto di amare mia figlia. Hai pianto sulla mia veranda per chiedere la mia benedizione, mentre pianificavi di rubare la mia terra per pagare I debiti della tua famiglia fallita a Firenze. I turned back to the room and switched seamlessly back to English, my voice rising slightly so that every single person on that terrace could hear me clearly. I heard every single word you said at Acre and Vine, I said, the English words landing on the table like heavy stones. You thought because I work with my hands, I couldn't understand the language of your schemes. You were wrong. The silence on the terrace was absolute. You could have heard a single leaf drop onto the grass. 40 faces turned first to Lorenzo and Bianca, who were sitting there frozen, looking like wax figures in an exhibition, then to Matteo, and slowly toward Clara. Clara's face had gone from confusion to a pale, shattering realization. She looked at Matteo, her lips trembling. Matteo, what is he talking about? It's a misunderstanding, Clara. Matteo stammered, his polished, smooth demeanor completely disintegrating as he reached for her hand. Your father is crazy. He's making this up. Don't touch her, I said. Marcus Sterling stood up from his seat, opened his leather briefcase, and pulled out 3 thick folders. He walked down the long table and placed them directly in front of Clara, opening the first page. 2 weeks ago, I said, looking at Matteo, your lawyers in San Francisco prepared a joint family agricultural trust. You told my daughter it was a wedding gift, a way to protect her winemaking assets. But what you actually structured, Matteo, was an offshore cross-collateralization agreement that used my 60 acres of debt-free land as the primary guarantor for your family's €9 million debt in Italy. I tapped the folder in front of Clara. Your family's winery in Tuscany is in active liquidation, I said, looking at Lorenzo. Your villa has tax lines dating back 3 years. And Matteo, the handsome, successful import-export broker you wanted to build a life with, Clara, has an active civil fraud lawsuit against him in Florence for fraudulent bankruptcy. If we had signed that trust next week, the Italian banks would have seized this entire estate by next month. Clara looked down at the documents. Her eyes scanned the translated court records, the bank foreclosure notices, and the signatures on the trust drafts. I watched her entire world shatter and rebuild itself behind her eyes in a matter of seconds. Matteo stood up, his voice rising in a desperate final attempt to salvage the con. Clara, listen to me. My family's estate is historic. We were going to restructure. It's just business. It doesn't mean I don't love you. Clara looked at him, and in that moment I saw my own stubborn, quiet strength rise up in my daughter's face. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her face went as cold and solid as the granite walls of my wine cellar. You called my father a rustic fool, she said, her voice quiet but carrying a freezing draft that made Matteo flinch. You sat at our table, drank his wine, and called the redwood table he built for my 12th birthday garbage. You made me a pawn to bail out your family's fraud. She reached down, slow, deliberate, and pulled the custom diamond engagement ring off her finger. She didn't throw it. She didn't make a scene. She simply dropped it into Matteo's untouched glass of Cabernet, where it sank to the bottom with a quiet, definitive splash. I was going to spend my entire life with you, she said, looking him dead in the eye. And you were going to spend yours robbing me. Get off our land. Matteo stood there, his mouth opening and closing, completely stripped of his charm, his pedigree, and his future. Behind him, Lorenzo and Bianca sat in absolute ruined silence, realizing in real time that their entire desperate, high society gamble had just been completely pulverized by the very contractor they had dismissed as furniture. I walked over to the leather folder Marcus had left on the table and pulled out a second document, sliding it across the table until it rested against Lorenzo's trembling hand. That is an itemized invoice, I said, keeping my voice mild and conversational, for every single expense your family has accrued during your stay in my guest cottage. The fine champagne, the vintage Cabernet, the prime steaks, and the housekeeping fees. And attached to it is a formal legal notice of trespass. You have exactly 20 minutes to clear your things out of my cottage before the county sheriff arrives to escort you off my property. Lorenzo looked down at the invoice, his jaw working like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to find some elegant, aristocratic insult to throw back at me. But there was absolutely nothing left to say, not with 40 local vintners and business partners staring at them in disgust. Not with a folder full of international bank fraud documentation sitting open on the table. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow, appreciative sip of my private reserve Cabernet, and set it back down on the stone with a quiet, deliberate click. And Lorenzo, I added, offering that same warm, easy American smile. I paid for tonight's dinner out of my simple department store pocketbook. I'd say you're welcome, but we both know you don't mean it when you say thank you. The guest cottage is unlocked. I'd suggest calling a taxi to take you to a hotel in Yountville. But I hear the rates are quite expensive this time of year. None of them said a word. Lorenzo stood up slowly, his elegant posture completely broken, and walked toward the driveway with Bianca trailing silently behind him, her head bowed for the first time in her life. Matteo followed them, his eyes locked on the stone path, a hollow, ruined shell of a man. Together, we watched them walk away from the long table, past the beautiful string lights, past the wildflower centerpieces, and out into the dark Napa night. Clara walked over to me, her shoulders shaking slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. I stood up and wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close against my chest, letting her lean her forehead against my shoulder just like she used to do when she was 12 years old and had had a bad day at school. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Thank you, Dad," she whispered back, her voice tight but steady. "Thank you for hearing what I couldn't." "Always, sweetheart," I said. Always behind us, the string lights kept glowing over the long tables, casting a warm, golden light over a community that had stood by us for 30 years, and a father and daughter who had walked into a storm of lies and come out on the other side. Finally safe, finally honest, and finally free. The fire in the hearth always outlasts the winter storm, as long as you keep the right wood burning. If you felt the warmth of Gideon's and Clara's loyalty today, go ahead and hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from tonight. Take care of your loved ones, and I'll catch you on the next one.